Hello. I don't know if I need this. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are from. Thank you very much for all of you being here, and welcome to the first talk of our annual research forum seminars. Just wanted to say, like last year, like every year, I wanted to just say a few words about the seminars. We have 8 seminars every year. They are a mix of distinguished speakers who come from outside the university, like our speaker today, Dr. Ozcan, and not less distinguished internal speakers from our department. This is done by design, so PhD students and new faculty get to know each other better, because sometimes PhD students don't have a chance to really understand the work or get exposure to the work of our own faculty. So we hope that you like this mixture of outside and internal speakers. You probably know that we put a lot of effort into those seminars. We think that they're a very important part of building a common scientific, academic, professional culture in the department. This is sometimes the only chance you have to see other people from the department. So we're very happy that you're here. We hope you will come to every seminar, regardless of the topic. Some PhD students were telling me, I only go to the ones in demography. I'm like, well, that's not how it works, because we are the Department of Social and Political Sciences, and I have to say, I am in the area of political sciences, and I learned a lot from the talks organized by sociology, because there's always something to learn about each other's discipline. And I will end before Pau introduces our distinguished speakers by telling you that if you're teaching master's students, remember the PhD students is a given that they're supposed to be here, but the master's students, please encourage them to come and give them some credit. That really works. In my own courses, I do that, and they like it. You know, this combination of internal and external motivation works very well. So without further ado, I will give the microphone to Pau, Professor Baithan, to others who will do introductions.
Thank you. Well, it's a very great pleasure to introduce Berkay Ozcan. I think many of you know him from the time he was PhD student here. Well, after that he was at the Yale and then to the London School of Economics, where he now is full professor of social and public policy. He's a very interdisciplinary scholar. He's been working on many topics, some of them on, well, especially on family processes, on women's labor market outcomes, including gender wage gaps, child outcomes, including health and well-being, and how all this interacts with policies. And again, how all these are related, all these processes are related to economic inequalities. I'm sure you will very much enjoy his talk, so I leave the floor. Thank you very much.
Is that okay? Thank you. I'd like to stand, if that's okay. So, well, thank you very much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be back at home. I'm an intellectual product of this setting, so whatever Pau says is actually, I owe quite a lot of them to this department. I've been in my career trajectory similar departments, so I just want to iterate the words that in interdisciplinary setting, it's incredibly enriching to be exposed to the research that is done by the adjacent disciplines rather than just your own field. And I benefited from it, and I hope you do too. So today's talk will be, without further ado, is about a very recent project. To be honest, some of the estimations, as it happens in everybody's life, that were done by Tuesday together with Rafael. We were on Zoom 6 hours. He went back home, and at night, his wife gave a birth. So as of yesterday, we were talking about fertility and children, and then he became a father. So Rafael Carranza is a youngest, recent assistant professor at University of Chile and a former PhD student of mine. And then we've been thinking along these ideas of like a descriptive paper, very in the style of Ala Esping Anderson.
Sorry for the interruption. People
Yeah.
from home say that they don't hear you.
Okay.
We don't understand what the problem is, but do you think that you could...
I can speak and sit and speak.
Yeah.
If that's going to make it easier. Oh, yeah. Okay. Is it possible that I'm muted on Zoom? Okay. Okay.
I think it's on.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Great. But I need the keyboard to change the slides. So I'll just be an animated.
You're the first one, the guinea pig of the technology.
Recording in progress.
Speak now.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
Could you be that Sandra Ruano is muted? Sandra Ruano Hernandez? See, maybe the administrator or the instead of muted.
Well, this happens in the post-Zoom world everywhere, in every university, so. Okay, so. Okay.
They say they hear him now?
Okay.
You may use the chat to send a message asking people if.
Or they may give feedback if they don't.
T'hauries de sent per aquell micro ara.
Okay.
Did they tell you that they hear him? Sí. Okay. Puc agafar això per Google? Sí. Is this good or you also need the mouse?
Perfect. I don't need the mouse. Great. So the name on it, the talk talks about concentration of children on income distribution and what happens in consequences. Actually, our starting point was a very old question, the question that was being asked by Malthus in the 18th century. Do rich people have more children than poor? You know, I'll just do a bit of an introduction about this big debate that entertained a lot of economists and social scientists throughout the 20th century. The Malthus asked this question because he was worried about if rich people are having more children than poor, over time the growth of incomes would generate famine and other difficulties and so on. But economists have been thinking that very logically, if we think that children are considered to be as normal goods, whose consumption increases as you have more income, then you would have, obviously, as increase in incomes, and the number of children should increase. However, empirical works rarely find that positive correlation. On the contrary, empirical work often finds a negative correlation. As people get richer, their children has been much less, both across the countries and also within the country across the income distributions. So this is a typical graph that is prepared by Jones and Terselt in 2008 using historical data sets in the US. And it's reworked by Matthias Sopke when they wrote this big economics of fertility overview for the handbook of Oxford Family Economics in 2023, and the most recent graph. And it shows the 1948 cohort is the most recent cohort that they have found the data for, which is the cohort of Gösta, I believe your cohort. So across these cohorts, number of children ever born to these cohort members, that they have sufficient time that they were being observed, the negative correlation is quite evident in the US. And you would find the similar patterns in almost all advanced economies where they, throughout the time. But they argue that over the latest cohorts, that negative correlation became nearly zero. It's almost flattened out. So what happens to the theoretical models that they say if children are normal goods and the more incomes should generate more children doesn't really hold, because over the time period where we look at the cohorts where the incomes go up, the children have been reduced. But that's quite elusive positive correlation bothered a lot of social scientists and demographers as well as the economists alike. Berkay started working on the theoretical models to explain why there is a lack of positive correlation. His starting point was not to explain negative correlation, but a lack of positive correlation. There are many theoretical models thrown out there to explain these. One of them is well-known quantity-quality trade-off, and people talk about maybe income should be think about in the household context where husband and wife earnings differentials, or we think about the human capital interruptions and then how the opportunity cost of children. And these many models have been fit partially to the data to show that, that explains why the lack of positive correlation. But to be fair, economic historians and historical demographers have found and identified positive correlation on exotic populations. For example, if you look at the DHS data sets on the very low fertility countries, like namely select countries in sub-Saharan Africa, or if they look at the very historical data sets of the 19th century in France or Italy in certain areas and regions, they found a positive correlation or evidence of positive correlation where incomes have gone up, children have gone up. And also there is large literature who wanted to dive in micro relationship between income and fertility. In that micro relationship, they employed a bunch of quasi-natural experimental techniques to show that if one's income increases, win a lottery or salary rise or promotion, their fertility goes up. So what is happening at the individual macro level is not happening at the aggregate level in the society or across the income distribution. So that was our starting point. But other starting point motivation is, sorry,
it's me. I was checking the messages. Let me get out. Apologies. Someone send me a message.
So the recent literature, sorry.
Yeah. I'm trying to do it. Leave. Someone sent me a text message and they wanted me to read the message that was sending on.
I'm sorry about that. No, that's all right. So the Matthias Opke and colleagues at the LSE, they produced this big review article that they talked that much of that discussion that entertained a lot of economists trying to explain the lack of positive correlation and actually evidence of negative correlation throughout the, up to 2000s have disappeared in post-2000 period. They argue that there is no negative correlation anymore. And they show a bunch of descriptive stats and cite about 6-7 papers. In our reading, none of them are at the individual micro level. So that we know that micro level analysis on the incomes of people in causal work that they increase fertility. We know that at the aggregate level, when you take income as the GDP per capita and cross correlation of countries, the negative correlation has disappeared. So this is a graph from them. So they show that negative correlation up to in 2000, like 1980 graph, have turned slightly positive, and then post-2000, they argue that the positive sign is almost there for the cross-country correlation. But then the discussion on income and fertility across the income distribution and where the children are has been quite absent. So in our reading from 2008 onwards until 2023, we have identified only 3 papers that looked at the relationship between income and fertility, or income and children. I'll come back to the discussion about why I use the term fertility, because we locate ourselves within that literature, but it's actually not the fertility that we are looking at. And they're not looking at the fertility either. They look at the completed number of children, or completed fertility, or number of children ever born to the individuals or people's total number of children. So we have identified only 3 papers that look at Sweden, US, and France. Martin Kolk looked at the Swedish data, looking at the cumulative incomes and then their fertility. A bunch of US data came from economic historians, and then there's a France data in the last 15 years. It seems like it's not only the positive correlation is elusive, the discussion of correlation between income and fertility is elusive in the literature in the last 10 years. So what we do is basically we ask in this study, they say like, where are the children in the household income distribution? Are they in the poor part or rich part or middle part? And are they more in the rich part or poor part or middle part of the income distribution when we look at the household income distribution and don't dive into the discussion about actually getting at the causality? Or so we want to see first, in the first hand, descriptive evidence that are we seeing a reversal in the trends in the last 15 years? What we do is we propose using concentration indices. These indices are developed for understanding of wealth concentration and income concentration. Kakwani and Stephen Jenkins, my colleague at the LSE, has developed these indices in early 1990s to look at the wealth and income concentration, to apply for the children for the first time, to say that we both want to look at childlessness, the zeros, as well as like number of children, the higher parities, on the full income distribution to see where they are. These indices are useful. I'm going to talk a good chunk of this talk today about why we should be using these indices to illustrate these phenomena, and then show that actually children in almost all high-income countries are increasingly concentrated on the top part of the income distribution, top meaning like about 75th percentile and above. And in those countries, when we look at the market incomes before the welfare state gets into the game, so taxes and transfers, but people just earnings, so to speak, where children are concentrated in the top part of the income distribution, when you look at the welfare state distribution on top of it, it becomes even more concentrated higher up. And then we say that like much of these family benefits are becoming more regressive in that sense. And then we look at also the implication of extreme concentration of children in a narrow band of income distribution, its impact on the standard tools we use, such as OECD modified economy scale. Is it up fit for the purpose? And should we use other type of economies of scale when the concentration goes up? And then we estimate the effect of these high concentration of children in certain part of income distribution. What does it do to inequality? What does it do to poverty? And moreover, child poverty. That's the point of the talk. And we contributed to two strands of literature. One of them is the fertility differentials literature, which discussed the ones that I have talked about, rich and poor differences in number of children. The literature is very much interested in dynamics. So they understand over the transition period, like which group among the rich or the poor start reducing their fertility first and the other group catch up later. And then in the status differences, they understand that some sort of Kuznets curves, as economists have argued, a U-shaped curve where the first rich reduces and then the poor reduces the fertility, and then at different stages, and then they start increasing more. And that literature has talked a lot about the demographic transition, and then there's a few demographers have contributed to that literature too. And then their discussion on poverty inequality has been limited. I think the Berkay paper is the only one that explicitly talked about that transition, how it affected actually fertility on very low income countries, like the DHS countries and the India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. There's another literature that's on the advanced economies, which was big when I was a PhD student here, and when Gösta was writing his book on Incomplete Revolution, this literature was taken up, looking at the family structure effect on the income inequality. And there were a lot of counterfactual simulations and decompositions were being done about how much of the inequality that we observe are because of the changes in family structure. Now we have the focus on single mother households have increased on the rise versus coupled households and unmarried households and so on. And children may be non-randomly allocated across these different household types, and that may have a contributing effect on the overall inequality. Much of that literature had very narrowly focused on the single mothers versus non-single mothers and like select advanced economies. And a notable exception to focus on from the children's perspective was the Burst-Western, Deirdre Bloom, and Christine Parcheski ASR paper, which looked at families with children and without children, looked at the variance of inequality over 30 years in the US, and they argue that much of the inequality has happened among the families with children in the income distribution. But then this literature often does some sort of decomposing variance of income, which is a weird measure of inequality itself. And sometimes what they do is in these counterfactual predictions that they look at the predicted income and its Gini, which is by definition is very compressed, so it cannot be the true inequality, it's the predicted inequality. So we also contribute to these literatures by introducing a new method called recentered influence function regression, which is called RIF regression, I'll explain later, to estimate these problems in a more realistic way. So I'll just skip to this, and let's talk about the data. Our data is basically Luxembourg income studies data, a bunch of cross-sections of 24 countries. We had 25 countries, that's on the title and abstract, and one of the countries, Austria, we had to drop, I think, in some of these estimations. So what we look at is two periods, essentially. It's not true dynamics. I'll come back to the true dynamics as well. We'll look at the US case on true dynamics. It's two cross-sectional snapshots in late 80s, early 90s, and now, let's say 2020s. And we look at the sample of children aged 14 or younger, and we look at the list definition. Luxembourg Income Studies defines a factor income, which I'll come back to it. It's basically market income plus one or two things more. And then we look at the number of children as our focus to see where they are on the distribution. And then these are the countries. So we assess the position of children, like using concentration index. It's a summary statistics, very similar to Gini itself. And it's a bivariate measure. The advantage of it is it looks at concentration of children. It's ranked by income, so it combines two variables into one. And we'll use the total household factor income, which has earnings of both husbands and wives or any other adult in the household who's earning income, and other rental capital income that is getting into households, and then pension income for non-contributory, and other fringe benefits that are not from the state, and own consumption. This is extremely small, so for definitional purposes, I'm putting it here. It doesn't really affect much. The reason why we want to focus on market income is that I want to understand the logic of if the having children is becoming something exclusive to certain part of the income distribution, is it non-attainable for the rest of the part of the society? That means that I need to focus on an income definition that is free from government interventions, family policies, state benefits, and so on. So this is sort of the income that's the market income, that whatever they earn before the state intervenes. Again, I have to make the disclaimer, this is a descriptive paper, so the causality issues loom large everywhere, but we want to start with the idea. So the concentration index is a function of number of children and income rank and relative to the average number of children, defined by Jenkins and Kakwani in 2 seminal papers, and it's interpreted similar to Gini coefficient, because this formula can be worked out to make it very similar to Gini, but it's a covariance of these number of children and their rank in the distribution adjusted by the average incomes of the distribution, which is something that we want. And it becomes bounded between -1 and +1, unlike Gini, is 0 to 1. When it's less than 0, so we say that concentration becomes more in the bottom of the income distribution. There are more children concentrated on the bottom. If it's 0, so the children are everywhere on the income distribution equally. If it's +1, concentration of children happens more on the top. And interpretation is similar in the sense that you can actually draw the Lorenz curve based on this index. And C does not depend on the shape of income distribution. Income here only provides a ranking. That's also an advantage that I'll talk about. So this is from our data. We picked up Taiwan as a good example in the list data, because it's one of the countries that undergone this dramatic distributional change, where in the dashed red line, Taiwan 2016 shows like a Lorenz curve here. The more curvature here, it means more concentration on the top. If it goes up the equality line, there is more concentration on the bottom. And the dashed line is the equality. So the cumulative share of population ranked by income is the same as cumulative share of children in each percentile. So we see that in 1986, children were born almost everywhere. The curve was closer to the equality line. Actually on the top, they were even going above the equality line, which means that for those percentiles that they were underrepresented. So, but by 2016, literally 30 years later, concentration became very positive and quite high, 0.28, which means that children have moved from being everywhere born or everywhere present in the household income distribution to only present on the top part of the income distribution. But that's a pattern that you would observe in much of the OECD countries. So if you look at that in 1990, the concentration index, few countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, and Poland, maybe, but they're closer to the equality line, were concentrated, are less concentrated now in 2020 than in 1990. Majority of countries are on the upper part of this equality line. That means they shifted to higher concentration. This is our starting premise. We say, if children are more likely to be present on the top parts of the income distribution, some countries really rank this race, such as Netherlands, have gone up from 0.2 to 0.3.5, this dramatic shift. So children are not appearing at very few rates on the bottom. Demographers have studied this phenomenon from a binary point of view. They studied, well, let's look at the socioeconomic gradient in childlessness. And that means that they're only looking at this negative side of it and then say, who has children, who don't have any children. The advantage of concentration index is we look at the childlessness as well as higher parities, who have 4 children or 3 children in addition to 0 children. So this is the advantage of combining these indices, not only look at the socioeconomic status gradient on childlessness. And also, in recent demographic work shows that actually childlessness is not really correlated with quite a lot of known factors such as delay in fertility or other things anyway. So this sounds like a secular phenomenon. And I want to make sure, I want to convince you hopefully in the next slides that this is a secular independent trend. So we say that, okay, so this is market income. We wanted to take away from the welfare state, but if you want to look at the disposable income, a number of countries also shift here more up. And if you look at the x-axis, we are now reaching to, in Sweden, almost 0.6 concentration. It's incredibly high, which means that almost every country, when you look at the welfare state transfers and benefits, moves into more concentrated in the disposable income household distribution. It's an indication that a lot of welfare state transfers goes to families with children, And if their levels are already high up, if the children are born to higher percentiles, they are getting more resources from welfare states. So these policies might be, in one way, regressive, so to speak. And you may say that, like, okay, so much of this increase in concentration might be because people are delaying their fertility. What does that mean? If the fertility is delayed towards 30s and 40s, which is coming to the prime age where people earn higher incomes than they used to. So if that is driving much of your income distribution, first thing you should do as a good, well-trained demographer, that you should adjust by income. So what we did here is an age adjustment. I don't want to go into details, which is very standard in econometrics. We just run a bunch of regressions on age dummies and residualized age factor income, and then we run the same concentration index on age residualized income results, and where the concentration indices scales reduce dramatically. So it's true that much of it is driven by actually age patterns, increasing the people are having children at an age where they have higher incomes and more established themselves, and that becomes that they move them upward part of the income distribution. But still, a lot of countries, still Scandinavian countries here, are on the higher part of the concentration, even once the age is taken into account. And when the age is adjusted, these countries should be similar in their ways, if entire thing is driven by age. So given this great level of variation, we argue that it's not actually age, it is defining this pattern. There is a secular increase in location of households where the children are more and more present. And we've done other sorts of age adjustments, such as we looked at, let's exclude from the whole pool of households, all the retirees and pension households. If they are below poverty line, they would be ranked in the earlier part of the distribution, pushing everyone up. If we take them out, I have a bunch of slides at the end, I have to show them. If we take them out, almost no country moves. It's not the elderly population that's shifting. So it's somewhat the age at fertility, but the majority of it is something else, as children becoming costly and somewhat costlier in some other countries. So these were two data points, 1990 to 2000, and we said, like, okay, we can pick up one country, such as the US, and we look at the trends rather than look at the two data points in full years. The trends show, and we've done three things here. So we look at the age-adjusted factor income, and the factor income plus pension is the one that what we call the market income, and then the disposable income, this is after taxes and transfers. What we see is here is that the earlier part of the century, there's a decline in the concentration of children, which is very much in line with economic historians arguing that somewhat post-war period is an exceptional period where positive correlation could be found for small windows. But then it has gone up dramatically. What is remarkable here, it has gone up more dramatically. I can't show it here, but it's actually 2010s until 2020, the last decades. There's dramatic gone up in market incomes, but once you take into account the age-adjusted factor income, it's flatline. So there's something going on here between the market incomes being driven by the age-adjusted income. But what is more interesting is here, the change in concentration from negative to positive. This is the part where we see that concentration started moving dramatically free of age in a secular pattern, and it has gone up and stayed there for the US. And you find similar patterns for most countries in the beginning of the century, where the demographic transition was happening for much of these countries. But some countries, as you have seen in the previous slides, such as Sweden, is really on the top. Their concentration levels stable at high. And other countries are catching up, and some countries, such as, I think Germany has declined a bit, and then catching up in the last 10 years too. So the high concentration is happening. The remarkable thing is there's no negative concentration here. The axis is positive on the side. It's always on the top of the income distribution. So we thought that this is super strange. We didn't find any discussion of income correlation with fertility literature in the last 15 years, anyone talking about where are the children born. It seems like it's entirely dropped out from the discussion. So we thought that maybe there are some consequences to this trend, and let's start with thinking about it. And because we are in the earlier stages, any feedback is welcome, because we have been brainstorming, Rafael and I. First is that we realized that whatever the choice of equivalent scales that we apply made a huge difference. And we wanted to understand why. So in this part, I'll talk about the impact of equivalent scales on inequality. Equivalence scale elasticities usually are the tools that we use them to adjust the needs of different types of households to make sure that they enjoy living standards that are similar to each other. Imagine a single mom with 1 child versus dual earning couple with 4 children. We do think that in household income inequality literature, if we want to make these 2 different household types as similar as possible in terms of their living standards, people almost automatically these days use equivalence scales. And one of the most commonly used equivalence scale is the OECD's modified equivalence scales. Much of the Eurostat's official poverty inequality estimations apply OECD's economies of scales, which basically does some sort of adjustment for the type of household that they do, predominantly as a function of number of children and number of people in the household. Nothing else is considered. There are some other discussions in the equivalence scale discussion. Maybe the needs of a household who has a disabled person shouldn't be equal to the need of a household who doesn't have a disabled person. We don't get into that. And actually, none of the policy sphere actually gets into other dimensions of the needs adjustment, but very standardly, almost every statistical office adjusts some sort of equivalence scale to them. And you can compute an elasticity measure by looking at the scale that is being used to make sure that the household size of A is comparable to the household size B, adjusted by the household size itself. So the commonly used scales are per capita, which you don't do. Every individual is accounted as 1. The idea of it is that, even though there are some cost scales, every individual consumes sufficient amount in the same household, so we want to count them as equal. And then the OECD scale, which varies. The first 2 adults are counted by with a decreasing function, and then the 3rd adult and 4th adult children have the half, and that stays stable. And then square root is only applied in the US as far as I know, maybe some Latin American countries that I may not be sure, but it's a very typical US equivalence scale. So square root basically takes the square root of number of people in the household and applies to the income. And then some people, they look at, we don't do any adjustment and then household income. The elasticity measure gives us how much adjustment each of these scales for poverty inequality estimations does on the incomes of the households. So, yeah, I don't need the OECD scale, but if I can go just for a second. These elasticities show that how much weight is given to each additional adult in the household in the OECD scale, and then how much they're similar to the square root scale for the US. This is going to be important in my presentation because we're going to compare the US at some point. So we noticed that there's quite larger differences in terms of inequality estimated as concentration grows depending on the economies of equivalence scales that we use. This is an interesting graph that we thought hard about it and whether it makes sense to you, so let me walk through. Total income is applying no economies of scale, assuming that each individual consumes as much in a household of 5 and a household of 2. And assuming no adjustment for children or so, and then this is assuming maximum adjustment to everyone. So we wanted to get these economies of scale 1 and 0, the highest range that you can use these tools, and say, can we calculate the Gini inequality for a population with maximum adjustment, with no adjustment, and see the difference between these 2 inequality measures. If you do maximum adjustment, where does the Gini look like? And if you do no adjustment, where does the Gini look like? And that difference is positive in most countries, but what is more striking is highly correlated with concentration index that we show. So correlation is positive and highly correlated. That means that the more children are concentrated on the top, the role of these adjustments become bigger and bigger as they go. So for countries such as Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and so on, where they had already baseline levels were highly concentrated, and they have gone even more concentrated, some of them, such as Norway and Finland, not the Sweden and Denmark. That means that we are doing a lot of work because of the economic scales that we use for them. But equivalence scales are not doing much work for the rest of the countries where there is no concentration of children. When they are on the bottom part, actually they are reducing. So location of children on the income distribution did matter hugely for the tools that we choose to estimate inequality and poverty. And so that begs the question of how much we actually trust that the equivalence scales do what they need to do, given their simplicity. So we decided to do the same exercise, choose 2 economies of scale. One of them is the Eurostat's OECD modified economies of scale, rather than these extreme adjustments, and use the US square root economies of scale, because US is insisting on that their adjustment in a different way in their census bureau. And then even though when we choose very similar equivalent scales, the correlation is positive with concentration index, and there's variation between them. So quite innocuously, we think that these economies of scale, like equivalent scales that are adjusted for poverty inequality estimations, become more and more of a problem as we see higher concentration of children. So now children are more concentrated on the top, high-income families, larger equalization, and distribution becomes more compressed on the top. So we discount in those countries, especially Scandinavian area, a lot more the cost of economies of scale within the household sharing resources in those countries than in Portugal, for example. We do think that those countries somehow has more efficient economies of scale than they would be doing in Portugal. Or at least the share of inequality reduced by those scales is a lot more dramatic than the other countries. And also equivalent scales with higher elasticity will see higher decreases. Per capita income inequality is lower than total income inequality, and comparing these 2 OECD, which is the official Eurostat versus official US, still highly correlated with concentration indices. So then what is the impact of it in the total inequality, child poverty, and total poverty rates? So here are a bunch of correlations that you probably know. So income inequality has been growing in most countries. So we say, okay, maybe just pay our dues to the list data and produce the same thing on the list data anyway, something that we already know. So in 1990, Gini coefficient were here, like about 6 countries have reduced income inequality, and about like 18 countries have increased their income inequality between these 2 years. This is less clear in poverty, but more clear in child poverty. But you may think that child poverty is naturally a mechanical thing, which I'm going to talk about. If children are born in the high-income countries, we shouldn't be seeing child poverty, right? So naturally, the children are going to be not so much on the bottom part of the income distribution where the poverty lies. So, but what we see is that there's also some increase, like the majority of the countries still increase in the child poverty, despite the fact that the children are increasingly born on the top. So there's a secular trend increase in child poverty too. Few countries here, they reduce the child poverty. Yesterday, like 2 days ago, I think in the Stone Center, there was a big forum about US child poverty, what happened to that. Janet Gornick and her team made a launch about child poverty in the US. There's this discussion about whether actually it is reduced or it is not reduced. But in much of the countries, we see, despite the fact that children are less and less born on the bottom part of the distribution, we see an increase in child poverty. Total poverty is not necessarily there. It's much of a mixed figure. So I think we have 9, 10 countries that have reduced the total poverty, and other countries have increased. The mechanisms are unclear for the total poverty. I'll come back to this too. But what happens in these trends of increased child poverty and increased inequality, once we want to correlate concentration of children, what is our expectation? What is our prior to that? Having more children on the top of the income distribution, should it really increase the inequality? We see a negative correlation here across the countries. You can do this, we wanted to do with the data set we have with 90 and 2000, but we could only take the 2020, where we had 50-something data set countries in less expanded data. Correlation gets very tight, much tighter than this. So which means that income inequality is actually negatively correlated with concentration indices. That's not what we would expect. If the children are more and more on the top, why it should be generating less inequality on one way or another. And we say the same thing on poverty. Correlation is less tight, but very clearly correlation, much tighter correlation with child poverty. But this is a mechanical link, because much of that negative correlation is produced by the equivalent scales that are adjusting on the top for certain countries. On cross-country correlation, they do a lot of work. And also, poor households are less likely to have children, so there might be like an artificial fact of children not being on the bottom part of the income distribution should be reducing child poverty, even though we see that child poverty has increased. So concentration should have some mechanical relationship with the 2 figures. But the key question is, so are they truly related to the cost of children? Is it some fertility preferences there? Joste has given this fantastic lecture about family in the 21st century, talks about intentions, ideal fertility, what people's preferences are. And we learned from that fertility preferences are incredibly stable across the countries over 3 decades. And if the fertility preferences are stable and the children are moving on the top part of the income distribution in most countries, that means that maybe children are becoming unattainable for the bottom part of the distribution. And if that is the case, then there might be some welfare gap that needs to be addressed by the policies. And what we have shown in these bivariate correlations is just looking at single factor and correlate with the other. Let's do a counterfactual simulation to capture the interaction effect of both things going on at the same time. So that's what in the third half of the talk that I want to do, show some counterfactual correlations. Because the combination of these factors may reinforce the concentration in children. So we call it relative importance of household composition. So we asked the question whether inequality and poverty change when children concentration changes, and previous studies typically use variance composition. Variance of what? They use earnings, typically, or variance of income or household income. It's a very strange inequality measure because it just tells us the spread, but not how unequal these things are. And other studies use predictions, which captures less inequality, which I already say, because then they observe actual incomes, because they come out of a model base. And there's some new literature relying on what they call it recentered influence functions, RIF, and which allows for using direct inequality measures as a dependent variable, as summary indices as the outcomes. It can be Gini, poverty, median, deciles, and so on, similar to the quantile regression logic. And you can run a regression conditional on the inequality adjusted dependent variable. And you can do the predicted counterfactuals like you would do in typical regression-based income, as the other literature does. But what you don't do is basically an estimate of predicted income, but you do a predicted Gini on top of it, which brings us almost identical to the observed Gini. So we do this exercise for both inequality and poverty. We look at the cross-section, all countries using the latest year, and we look at the trends also in the US. So the RIF regression is, just for anyone interested in formality, is this independent variable as a function of some sort of distribution statistics. That's mean variance quantile, but you can also use Gini and other summary measures that we use, tile, generalized entropy indices, and so on, as a function of a bunch of variables that you can actually adjust for. And that's an econometric paper by Firpo, Fortin, and Lemieux in 2009, and then Frank Howell at LSE and Sarah Fletcher at Paris School of Economics. They have used this list of influence functions for various inequality indices. They expanded this framework, and now it's becoming applicable in the literature more and more. So in our case, we look at the OECD's equalized household income, and then we look at the condition on Gini and poverty and headcount ratio, and we look at the factor income variables and number of children, including zeros, that we can look at it. The key figure here is that we look at the quintiles, 20% of the distribution, as dummies multiplied by number of children, because we don't only want to look at the childless households, zeros and ones, but we want to look at those households with 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, and so on. So this gives us a coefficient that we can estimate. There's this trade-off. If you look at the percentiles, you have 100 dummies here with number of children interacted. But in each percentile, you don't have enough data in survey data, so it becomes very crude. You have a lot of zeros, and then you can't estimate a lot of betas. If you have, let's say, quartiles, you have 4 dummies with number of children, it's too crude. But we have quintiles with 5 dummies with number of children that generates about a good 100 observation dummies that we can estimate and do the simulations. So we look at the bottom quintile, bottom 20%, middle 20%, and top 20%. And we look at the counterfactual share of households with children 20%. Why 20%? I have additional slides which I should perhaps go, and maybe I can at the end, I don't want to mess up. That Sweden and Netherlands and Germany, nowadays only 20% of their population have any children. If you look at the household distribution, all the households, almost all children are in the 20% of their shares, which is distributed at different percentiles, but much of the households don't have any children in those countries. So my counterfactual simulation, in a way that take a country like Portugal or Spain and see if they had the patterns of Sweden, how much inequality reduction we would have seen in the settings, that sort of exercise. Does it make sense? Okay. So this is for inequality. Imagine the diamond-shaped yellow are the ones, imagine that we have all children, 20%, squeezed in, like Sweden, Germany, but they're all happening on the very top of the income distribution. Our Gini would look like this. These are the countries, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland. These are the most recent years available in this. And here is the countries are Mexico and Chile on the very top. And this is Italy, I think Spain is here. So we say, okay, so what happens if all children are born to the bottom 20 percentile? And I think we don't have any country like that, because the low-income countries, or like other outside Scandinavia, the countries, when they have less concentration, they are spread across. But imagine that we have concentration of Sweden, but on the bottom. And that's the square dots here. And then the real, so middle doesn't make much sense, because middle is very close to what the original observed inequality is a black. So what we see, the striking pattern is, for a select few countries, if children are born on the top, very similar to Sweden case, those countries would have much higher inequality than there. And the sizes of shift in inequality is about like 4 or 5 percentage points, which is about 14% of their existing Gini, which is a large amount, that shift. It's not very small, because you would need a lot of jump in the income distribution to get about 14–15% increase in Gini. But for some countries where the concentration was almost negative or zero, where children are born everywhere in the income distribution, the jump is even much higher. So they become like dramatically more unequal. And we said like, okay, let's do it for the US, and let's do it for the time series for each years, rather than like take 2 years. And this is the trend of observed Gini, the black line. And now we allocate children, all of them to the bottom, to the middle, and to the top. So and then over the time trend, as we say, the dramatic change in something happened. The concentration of children started moving to the top. When you see the allocation of all children to the top in the Swedish pattern, if US had followed the Swedish pattern, they would have even higher inequality than they are observing now. But if they are allocated all to the bottom, it will be much worse inequality. It's partially because it's both the rank of the distribution and the number of children there. But if all children were born in the middle, concentrated, the inequality will be much reduced. So this is a sign that they say, okay, so the combination of multiple factors, when you do the counterfactual simulation, shows us where children are located does matter for inequality, and the sizable way. So, and then let's look at for the poverty for cross-sections. You know, it's not immediately clear how to think about relative poverty, because we want to look at the number of households that are poor below a threshold, and you may think about threshold changes as well, as distribution changes where the children are. So, but we still did the exercise and look at the bottom part of the, like if the bottom part of the income distribution had all the children in the society, they would have much higher poverty almost across the board in every country. And if the top, they would have much less poverty in the country. Part of it is mechanical, as we explained. And then for the US trend, this mechanical pattern continues. But what is remarkable here is that in the last years, where children being born on the top is almost similar to being born to the middle, in both cases, it's much less poverty than the US. So when the observed case in the US. So I'm finishing here with preliminary conclusions, because we're doing these exercises here. We say the effect sizes that we find, the location of children where they are born, on the income distribution, on inequality and poverty are quite sizable and quite large. And it's like they vary between 10 to 18% of Gini on the inequality, solely due to the location of children in the distribution. Obviously, children where they are born in the distribution is endogenous to the distribution itself. So the question is, when we look at these market incomes before in welfare state transfers, and we use these Gini on the disposable incomes, which is what I have done in all of these slides, what we see is that like some sort of welfare state transfers are helping families that they are increasingly becoming towards middle to upper middle classes and getting disproportional benefits from the welfare state compared to other families, which locates them in the disposable households more. So in some way they are becoming regressive. On the other hand, children not being born on the bottom part of distribution, so just merely showing that concentration indices are not negative, always on the positive side, that in the bottom part there is no concentration of children is a mixed news, good news in the sense that child poverty will be reduced, bad news in the sense that there are no children in the bottom part of the households. Maybe it's a welfare loss if that is coming out of unattainable cost of children. So we want to think about the next steps, so think about how to quantify and think about these welfare loss by looking at the benefits data. We are still in the middle of it, I'm working about it, and I just want to finish here to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Well, now it's time for questions. Oh, I see several hands raised. Okay.
And we need a microphone for you
Yes.
to answer. People
I'll
from
be
home
here.
cannot hear you.
Okay.
Is that working? Yeah, hopefully it's working. Yes.
Okay.
That's working. I think it's working, no?
Yeah.
Thank you, Berkay, for a very suggestive presentation. I have things that have come up to my mind regarding, first of all, the cost of the child. I wondered if the child's costs have increased over time, and that would affect the concentration index, because then if the child cost increases, it's more and more families of the high parts of the income distribution would be inclined to have them, but not children or not families at the bottom. That's one of the things that came to. Then another thing for the cross-national variation is employment security. You're looking at income, but not at the stability of income, and possibly that's something that people may have in the minds. I mean, people at the bottom of the income distribution are not only thinking of the level of income they have, but how likely they are going to have this income in the next year or the year after, or things like that. Then another thing that came to my mind is that you're looking at sort of family allowances or money, basically, but not services, not what the state can expend in family-friendly policies that could allow like this sort of in-kind things that would allow low-income families to have. And then there is one slide that sort of
I need to take notes because I'm going to be forgetting the three
well,
questions on the back to back.
Sorry. Well,
so shall I answer and then you ask more?
Okay.
Because I already forgot the first one. So it's an excellent point to look at the other source of in-kind benefits. Much of these Luxembourg income studies have very meticulous data sets about what the cash benefits are, but the countries have welfare mixed. If we had one way of quantifying all sorts of transfers and welfare mix, and I do think that we would be seeing even more concentration. So this is actually a lower bound of what we have observed in the data. Maybe there might be some country ranking shifts, but I think general pattern for all countries moving upwards will not change.
the other thing was the employment security. I mean,
and income security. That's an excellent question too. So there's only, as I said, one study that looked at Sweden. I think Martin Koch looked at the permanent income, life cycle income relationship with fertility. The idea is to see what the correlation is there. And I haven't seen this panel data approach of taking the stability of income and some sort of get the permanent income and the variance around it, so to take out the instability on it. These studies are more vulnerable to the idea of age bias. What stage in your life course, how many years of permanent income that you want to look at if you want to look at the correlation over the period? So it's true. So the income security, stability, and those factors might be driving some sort of fertility decisions. In the end, actually, we are not even looking at the fertility. We are looking at the households with children compared to households not with children. So, but you're right. I think that's a good point. And you had one more.
it was about the child cost. If
That's
the
right.
cost of the child has increased.
I think that's an excellent point because we do think that we don't go into the reasons why we have seen increases in concentration. We look at the consequences of it, but we don't look at the reasons why it. And very likely that child cost increases have pushed this trend towards upwards in the quality child literature. But why is it so much more dramatically in some countries than others? Do we think that the child costs in certain countries are much larger than the other countries within the quite a homogeneous set of countries in Europe? I would say the differences between Germany and Scandinavian countries is stark in terms of costs. And we do discount those costs by using equivalent scales in one country dramatically compared to other country, arguing that the costs are not similar. So that's the point that I'm trying to make, I think. Yeah. Thank you, Luis. Sorry, I cut it off, but you had more questions, so happy to talk later. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for, I don't know, does this work? Thank you very much for the presentation and a very interesting way. I'm totally beyond my field, so I'm learning a lot here.
Thank you for coming.
And okay, I'm going to say it in a very weird way. You're talking about redistribution of money,
Yeah.
but what about redistribution of children? So I find it interesting that you're not just looking at fertility, you're looking at families that have children, right? So I thought about two things. The first that came to mind is children in foster care or children who get adopted, almost entirely, as far as I know, come from the poorest part of society. Sometimes they're actually pressured into it, sometimes, and in countries like the United States, you can purchase a child for about $60,000. So the actual redistribution of children, of the families that have them, and the families that don't, could have something to do with that. And then I also was wondering about the medical tradition in the 20th century and part of the 21st of sterilizing poor people in many, many different countries in the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. I think our exercise doesn't, I mean, that's an interesting thought to think about. Okay, we allocate children to the bottom, allocate children to the top, as if we can do that in the simulation analysis. But you could, like our US data and other data sets, actually looks at who are present in the household at the moment. We have no clue whether they are adopted, stepchildren, natural birth or not. So we started with the fertility literature because that was the biggest literature that was interested in income relationship, where in the families and the income distribution are children born. But it's actually not fertility, as I say. This is, we get a snapshot of data and look at the households, how many children live in those households. Some are, I'm sure they are foster children in the US data. Some won't be foster children. And then we do these analyses that counterfactual simulations. What if the children are all born in certain part of the distribution? In a weird way, but actually it's almost eerily, creepily possible to think about buying children and then allocating to the different parts of the distribution. I find it, like, that's a very interesting question that I need to think about a bit more. And the second question you asked about was?
I mean, it was sort of both the same. Oh, the second question, I guess I was trying to think about why there is, you said there were kind of the causal questions are around. So I was trying to think of why there has been this shift, and I was just wondering kind of, can you take into account the redistribution? Not, I wasn't saying that you are, you know, taking children away and giving them. I understand that it's a counterfactual, but I think that in reality there has been this transfer. I mean, look at the history of Spain in the 20th century.
Fertilization.
And then the sterilization of poor people.
So there's a big group at LSE now talking about this eugenics history of fertility trends in the demographic group. I've been attending their seminars as a part of the demographic group. I'm learning about that literature in fertilization. These are all from the state point of view that can we allocate children through different means. I think it comes under the same umbrella of question that, as I say, like if this happens in practice, that we may need to do these counterfactual simulations, but I hope it doesn't. So.
No, but I'm telling you that it does. That's what I'm saying. Like, you need to take that into account. I don't know if it happens at a high enough percentage to affect your data, but it definitely does.
That's also another point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
As you know, couple instability has changed dramatically over this same period with polarization. So that low income and low educated are more and more unstable and vice versa on the top. So I was wondering what would happen to your income dominated estimations if you took into consideration couple instability as what another factor that would promote pretty much the same kind of results.
Right. That's a great question. So I might have some slides about that. So this is not, but I want to show still anyhow. So this is the share of children in households in 1990 to 20. So they have reduced, and then they are more concentrated. But I'm sorry, we do have, age adjustment. So somewhat gets there.
If you move away from the microphone.
Sorry, pardon Zoom people. So we try to play with the idea about like what equivalence scales actually take into account adults in the household. Say single adult, two adults, if the household polarization is a function of income distribution, where singles are on the bottom, duals are on the top. And so equivalence scale adjusts for the number of people live in the household, and we do think that we give lower weight for children, but if we don't give lower, like we forget about the children and then say like, let's say single versus 2 adults to take into account some sort of dissolution, divorce mechanisms. So this is a simulation of existing equivalence scales, which is the only interesting bit about that is once you have 2 adults on OECD modified economic scale, which is a dash triangle gray line, after 3 children, it approximates exactly as the square root of 2 adults in the US. What it means is that these equivalence scales treat numerous families with 2 adults almost the same in Europe compared to 2 adults in the US. We are relying a lot of them about how the household composition takes and to make US, UK comparisons. And they make dramatic differences, having an additional adult versus not. But the differences are not that much if we have a single-headed household versus dual-headed households. And they are not the added factor here. Much of that discussion is probably driven by, I don't have the slides here anymore. So much of the discussion that we tried is driven by where the childless couples are compared to high parity, compared to single mothers versus dual mothers and so on. So it's the difference between zeros and the high parity rather than adults, number of adults in the household.
Berkay, my question was about the overtime change
in
couple instability.
So this particular trend, I think in the US where things were going here. Right. This is early 80s, 90s where instability was going up, where it coincides with our trends. The peak divorce rate in the US was in 1982, right? And then since then it has stable, slightly declining over time periods. And that's actually might be playing around here because that's the year where we see the switch in the trend in concentration indices too. There might be something going on there too, so I think we may need to isolate those switching sign trends and then maybe look at these exercises of divorce in that period, yeah. Thanks. Does it answer the question? Somewhat. I want to hear more about your reaction, so.
I had a question on how actually the details of, I miss a bit about the details of the calculation. Who is included exactly, who is a child, and what are the age ranges and these things, because.
So.
And perhaps also the idea of some descriptive data about, you were saying that, the 20 bottom percent of the population is where people are, childlessness is concentrated, but it would be nice to see a bit
where they are.
Where they are.
Yeah, so good question, thank you. I skipped through a bit. So in our data, we look at anyone under 15, PISA, OECD design. One reason, above 15, you start seeing earnings for those people. So some 17-year-olds have incomes. So we wanted to understand, if you want to look at household equalization, children don't bring income, but they consume. So we want to adjust for the size of households by number of children. We should be thinking them, do they consume a lot? Do they consume little? Like how the cost of children are calculated across these countries. That's the reason why we opted out for the ILO, International Labour Organization definition, that they consider working age split, children age 14 or younger. We have everyone in the data. So we didn't impose an age cutoff on the top. So they go everyone in the data. But I did have additional analysis restricting the sample to households' heads where the head is 60, or like just the fertility window. Things shift a bit, countries, but largely patterns are quite dissimilar. So we thought that it's quite arbitrary because most of the official statistics in Eurostat, when they publish rankings of poverty across European countries, they look at all data. They don't look at restricted samples. So we wanted to follow that pattern of poverty and equality, say okay, let's look at all the data and then follow the Eurostat's estimation method and then see what we find out if children is assumed to be consuming nothing or consuming a lot. So that's that. And then when it comes to share description, so we've done this at the end. I had more slides, but I didn't get a chance to show it. So we wanted to see where, like, the share of children and number of children. So this is share of children 2020. This is share of households with children in 2020, and share of households with children in 1990. So, and this is if there hadn't been any change. So almost in all countries, share of children in the household distribution has shrank. So fewer and fewer households are now having children. They're all below that line. But some countries, like, I have Taiwan and Chile and so on, some of these countries, almost 60% of the households have a child or two, right? Whereas in countries like Denmark and Sweden, around 20% of the households have a child. And we know that their starting level were already high up in the concentration. So 20% of the households are having a child in those countries or have any child in the distribution, and those households are located on the top. That's our starting premise, right? So that's in these countries. And this is intensity, number of children. So we say among those households who have any children, can we look at average number of children where they are? And Italy is here, Germany is here, Sweden and Finland are here, so they have increased their number of children, but increased on a very narrow part of the income distribution. So 20% of the households in the whole sample, and the upper parts have increased their fertility, increased, much of it comes from those households.
And do you control for the age of the household head or something? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the age adjustment that we've done. I haven't shown how we did it, age adjustment, but on the factor income we do it. It's like it's replicating the pattern. Concentration shrinks a bit, so age does some work. You are right, so age is an effect, but it doesn't change the ranking of the countries in a way.
Is there any other question?
Thank you. Just following on this, maybe you already explained, but I think that household size is key, right? Because if household size is very small and therefore people are split it into many households, it makes sense that there's a larger part of the household without children than when people are concentrated in less households, so to say.
Yeah.
So this is one question, and related to that, I was wondering to what extent your results, not for all the countries maybe, but you could check for some countries, contrasting your estimations based on the concentration of children into households with fertility rates, right? By income of the, in this case, not the household, but the person, or I don't know.
Right.
I mean, so because I think it's really innovative the way you are presenting, analyzing fertility not with fertility rates, which is like the conventional indicator we demographers use, but this indicator of concentration in households. And I'm still, thinking about it, and what does it imply to measure without fertility rate, but with household concentration? I mean.
So, thank you so much.
If I can add something,
Yeah.
Maybe this can be related to the fact that large families have been shrinking. So the number of 3, 4, 5 children per woman has almost disappeared. And these were poor people, essentially, who were having. So if I understand you, I don't know. Okay.
Yeah. So, I think, without falling into this tautological thinking, I think you give me a great opportunity to talk about it. The reason why I thought that this wasn't studied in the last 15 years is that fertility differentials between how many children rich and how many children have poor over the demographic transition is studied in the last century because the dramatic reduction in the large families across the board. So if you take one of the papers that I cited, Johnson and Turtle paper, they have this nice graph of completed fertility for the US. Like from 1930s onwards or 20s onwards, the differentials are shrinking and shrinking. So we are now in a low fertility world across the board. All these countries are small family sizes. So the difference comes from, okay, so in most countries, fertility rates, and not fertility rates, but we have the average number of children in the households. Fertility rates are a bit more time period effects drive them a bit more. But the average number of children in our data that we see them, most countries are split between 1.9 to 1.5. It's actually quite a The difference is some countries, like every country has a smaller household. Some countries have smaller households distributed across the distribution. Some countries have households concentrated in one area and slightly bit more children than the others. That's the point that we were trying to make. I don't know whether it's interesting because, thank you so much. I appreciate your compliment about novel method of showing, but we were surprised that this is not much covered in the last 10, 15 years. All of these studies covered up until mid-2000s. There were quite a lot of discussion about does income really predict or does income not, and where in the transition period in fertility, second demographic transition, we see this income changes happening, but it's then stopped for some reason.
Any other question? Otherwise, we can stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.